right? Because when you read it, there are some things that ought to make you go like, I don't know about this. All right? Did anybody who read the book have any of these conundrums to share? Like I have them, but maybe, yeah, go ahead. Hold on, wait for the mic. It's coming, it's coming.
One of the biggest problems right off the bat was she wasn't really supposed to be getting married to a Gentile.
Yes, this is true. One of the biggest ones, and I have it on my slide here, I'll get to it in a second, but one of the biggest ones is that the Bible, in Deuteronomy and even in the book of Ezra, when people return to Jerusalem, one of the laments that Ezra or Nehemiah has, or both of them, is that all these men basically married Gentile women while they were in exile. The Old Testament and the law makes a huge deal about intermarriage between Jews and people from other countries. Anybody else? Yes. Hold on, wait for the mic, for the people online. It's coming.
I imagine that the first queen, Queen Vashti, she probably faced the ethical conundrum of, hey, look, her husband is telling her to dance and she should listen to her husband. On the other hand, her husband and all his friends are drunk, you know? So should I listen to him? Should I not and do my own thing? Well, she did her own thing and she got cut off and a lot of other things, but.
Yeah, to that, and actually somebody brought this up to me before service, somebody who read the book and actually read a commentary on it. You know, there's a lot of cultural things that a person who read this book when it was written would have understood that we don't understand because we're in a different time. But when Queen Vashti is being summoned to basically come, what the story tells us is that there's two banquets going on. There's one for the man and one for the woman. And these banquets were like banquets of excess. And so more than likely, there are women in the man's banquet who are basically there to entertain the man. And the queen is being called to do the same thing. Right? See, she is being called to, in one way or another, expose herself to all these men that are at this banquet. And one of the things that is under the surface, and I'll talk about this here in a second, that is under the surface in this story is a lot of sexual tension. All right? So anybody else conundrums that you saw in the story?
Yes, the violence and a lot of the revenge that was going on,
yes,
you know, against like Haman's sons, followers, or whatnot. Yeah, it was kind of.
Yeah, at the end of the story, basically, the Jews get a decree that they can defend themselves. And defend themselves they did. Like, the way the book is written is like, they go around killing a lot of people. All right? And so you kind of read that and go like, hey, I understand that you were oppressed here, but this seems a little excessive. All right?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I was actually studying with a friend who's Iranian, so she's Persian, and she actually went, like, I think to the grave site of where they believe Esther was buried, and she read, and we were studying out Esther together, and she read how many of her, like, ancestral people were killed,
right,
and that was really, really tough for her to wrap her head around why a good God would crucify or destroy her people.
Right. One other one, and I'll share what I have on my slide here in a second. But one other one that is interesting is that what the result of this story is a festival called Purim, right? That to this day many Jews celebrate, but it's a festival that isn't in Deuteronomy or Leviticus or any of those books, right? It's a kind of a made-up festival outside of the prescribed festivals that are in other parts of the Old Testament. And so even to this day, like really, really Orthodox Jews don't celebrate this holiday because they go like, this is not part of our law. All right? Now, hear me. One of the things also is that Esther hides her Jewish identity. She is told, like, hey, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish, right? Other books, like the book of Daniel, for example, is a similar setting of a story in which it's also a story that happens in a royal court. And the characters in that story are basically unashamed about the fact that they're Jews. All right? And I'll get to that whole Daniel and Esther part here in a second, too, because that's really interesting. Mordecai, all right, and we already talked about this, Mordecai and Esther basically willingly become part of the scheme for potentially her marrying a Gentile king. And again, scriptures like Deuteronomy 7, 23, Ezra 9, 1 through 10, you should go and read it. Ezra 9, 1 through 10, one of the biggest laments that Ezra has is that all these men, while in exile, have married Gentile women. And if I remember Ezra correctly, they actually get divorced. They get rid of all those women, which again, another ethical conundrum. But if you would turn your Bibles with me to Esther 2, because this is really interesting. All right? Yeah, we're good. I'm going to be reading out of the New Revised Standard Version, but you can read whatever you want. Where it is. We're going to start here in verse 12. All right? It says, the turn came for each girl, so just for context here, all these girls, all these virgin girls from all around Persia have been gathered, and they've been receiving some beauty treatments, and now it's turn for these girls to go see the king. All right? It says, the turn came for each girl to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the woman, since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfume and cosmetic for women. When the girl went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, then in the morning she came back to the second harem in custody of I'm not even going to try reading that, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the woman, advised. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that she set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers. Esther's banquet, he also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. All right? Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. And this is in the Bible. These girls go spend the night with the king after receiving a whole year of beauty treatment. What do you think is happening in that night? They're not just looking into each other's eyes, having a night-long conversation. All right? That is not what is happening. All right? Now, I'm going to say this very explicitly, but I want you to understand the only reason I'm saying this is because it's in the story. But basically, Esther became queen because she was better in bed than all the other girls. All right? Now, it's not explicitly said. Koya's already frowning at me. All right? It's not explicitly said, all right? But what do you think these girls are going in to spend a night with the king for? What would the king be delighted about? Like, again, conversation? Right? So one of the biggest conundrums of the story is the sexual content of it. Like, Mordecai is basically giving his virgin daughter, all right, for this. Now, here's the thing. What do we do with all of this? What do we do with all of this? This is part of the story. All right? And the authors of the story are not doing anything to sort of hide it. This is the story. This is the story who the authors of Esther have given us. And these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. And here's the crazy thing. None of these conundrums are resolved. The book doesn't give us any resolution for these ethical conundrums. They are just there. Now, if you remember last week, one of the things that I wanted to do this week is talk about where God is in the story. All right? And so I want you to keep these conundrums in your head for now. All right? And we'll come back at the end because we have to talk about this part. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. To talk about God in this story, we got to get a little bit nerdy here. The Bible, I have really wrestled to think about how to say this, all right? Because one of the things that we have to understand is that, and I think I've said this before, we were not the intended audience for Scripture. Like, none of the authors of the book of the Bible were thinking like, I am writing this for people 4,000 or 6,000 years ahead, right, that have cell phones and use computers. Like, they were not writing for us. They were writing for people within their context and their culture, all right? And much like today we tell stories a certain way, they used to tell stories a certain way. And so they wrote stories in a certain way. So for us to get the full meaning of Scripture, sometimes we have to delve into their world. And the way that they structure stories is different than the way that we structure stories. We tend to go 1, 2, 3, beginning, middle, and end. And usually the climax of the story is between 2 and 3. And then everything kind of, the denouement that you learned in high school. Yeah. All right? But that is not how they told stories. All right? So this is the structure of the book. Let me get very professorial here. So hopefully you can see this. So basically, the way that this book is written is written in what's called a chiasm. All right? In a chiasm, basically everything flows to the middle. The middle of the story is the most important part. And a lot of times what they do is that they have the beginning. So you have Xerxes' banquet and then the second banquet. The end of the book, so for chapters 1 and 2, if you will, are parallel with chapters 9 and 10. So the book begins with 2 banquets, and it ends with 2 banquets. All right? Then there's the banquets, Vashti's banquet for the woman, Esther's enthronement banquet again, the feast of the Jews. All right? And then there's Haman and Xerxes' banquet, and then there's Esther's then the Jews feasting after Mordecai is exalted, if you will. And in the middle is Esther's first and second banquet. All right? Now, let me show you this. This is another arrangement of it. All right? And so, again, there's all these parallels, right? So A goes with A, B goes with B, C goes with C. But here is the interesting thing, and this is what I want us to read here in a second. In the middle of this is the royal procession, and you'll see what this is here in a minute, all right? But basically what I want you to see is that the climax of the story is right here in the middle. This has no parallel. There is no matching thing for what's down here, all right? Which then begs the question, what is that? What is that middle? All right, so we're going to read it. Oh, sorry. So if you turn with me to chapter 6. Sorry. We're going to start actually in chapter 5, and then we're going to read chapter 6, just to further the setting or understanding of the setting here, all right? So what we're about to read in Esther 5, verse 9, all right, what we're about to read is Esther has made her first banquet, and the only people in the banquet are her, the king, and Haman, all right? And so Haman is leaving the banquet, all right? It says Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits because he just ate and drank and was with the king, all right? But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Then he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the ministers of the king. Haman added, even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this does me no good so long as I see Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits. This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So these gallows that he made are basically 2 stories tall. Like, this is a huge structure just to kill one man, all right? But that is equal to his hatred. Now, here's the thing. This is where this gets interesting. We are now in the middle of the story, all right? On that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals, and they were read to the king. It was found written how Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who conspired to assassinate it, had told about that, who conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman has just entered the outer court of the king's place to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So the king's servants told him, Haman is there standing in the court. The king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what shall be done for the man who the king wishes to honor? Haman said to himself, whom the king wished to honor more than me? So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Then the king said to Haman, quickly, take the robes and the horse, and as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai, who sits in the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse and rode Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Here's the thing. The climax of the story, where all the fates turn. Like, literally, this is a reversal of fates. Before this, right, Haman was like the man. And he's thinking, I'm the man. And he even goes to the king thinking like, man, he's about to honor me. Let me tell him how he should honor me. Right? But here's the thing. The biggest turn of events in this story has nothing to do with any of the characters. The king couldn't sleep. Now here's another thing. All throughout the Old Testament, right, there are multiple times in which God communicates to people through dreams. So this is a theme. This, like, I can't sleep, right? God talks to people through their dreams. Like, God, like, communicates a lot of times within the context of sleep. And so any Jew would identify this as, like, this is the hand of God. This man can't sleep and asks for these records to be read to him. And he goes like, I've done nothing for Mordecai, who basically saved me. Right? But again, the biggest, like, after this, everything begins to go well for Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews. But that switch has nothing to do with them. Up until now, we have talked about all the characters, Esther and Mordecai, what it is that they do. All right? But here is the biggest event of the story up until now, and it's all God. It's all God. The biggest thing that happens in this story is God. This is in the middle, basically to tell us, like, hey, we've been learning about Esther and Mordecai this whole time, but God is not absent. God plays the biggest hand in this story. Now, let me bring back these ethical conundrums in this story, because this is important. These ethical conundrums basically leave us in a place where we go like, for as great as you think Esther and Mordecai are, you can also say, there's some questions here. Right? They didn't go back to Jerusalem. They're hiding in their identity. There's the whole sex stuff. There's the whole violent stuff, right? And you're kind of left like, what about all of these things? And yet, God still works. God still works. One of the big messages of this story, right, is that people don't have to be perfect for God to work. Here you have the life of a bunch of Jews on the line, right? And you would think that the heroes and everything is riding on the heroes of the story. And basically this story tells us, no. God is here. God is still working. And in spite of the questions that we could raise about these people's characters and their behavior and their righteousness, God is still here. Now, let me be very clear. This is not license for us to go and do whatever we want and go like, oh, God is working. All right? There's a whole other Bible, like there's plenty of pages dedicated to like, hey, behave in a righteous way. But here is the thing. Here's the thing. And I want us to understand this very clearly. All right? Last week I talked about how like we have to act, we have to make choices. Right? And a lot of times, like the world that Esther presents to us is not a simple world. And in a complicated world, there are no simple answers. A lot of times, right, we have the intent to make decisions and do good things. All right? But choices are not that simple. And many times what happens is that we just decide to not decide. Like we are paralyzed by like what is the right choice. We're paralyzed by it. We just go like, there doesn't seem to be a right choice, so I'm just going to decide to do nothing. All right? What this book is teaching, one of the biggest things that this book is teaching us, right, is that we ought to have the freedom to not worry so much about our decisions because God is working. I don't know any of us that will be as violent as the people in this book were, all right? Or that would make some of the choices that they made, right? In many ways, we are more righteous than Esther and Mordecai. And yet, we act a lot less. And yet, we act a lot less. That in many ways, I'm sorry, I'm just preaching to Nobi. Nobi, what I said is that in many ways, we're more righteous than Esther and Mordecai, and yet, we act a lot less. There you go. All right? And a lot of times, it's because we just are paralyzed by decision making. Because we think that, like, it all rides on this one decision, that it could go one way or the other. But that scenario completely ignores the hand of God. Again, here is an awesome story, and a story that turns out for the good. But the people in it, again, have a lot of questions to answer. Right? The book goes out of its way to show us that these people are not perfect. And yet, God used them and put them in a position to save their people. Right? And again, here we are. We've all put in places to do something. Something. And many times we decide to do nothing because we go, the choices are too complicated. But again, that thinking ignores the hand of God. God is always working. He works in ways that are completely unexpected. All right? And again, that ought to give us the freedom to go, you know what? I don't know what the right choice is. I'll flip a coin. I'll do this. But I know that God has my back. I know that even if the decision I make isn't the right one, right? Maybe God will intervene in some magnificent way, like letting a king not sleep. Again, the biggest turning point in this story has nothing to do with any of the characters. The king just couldn't sleep. This is something that we really need to believe. God is always working, even when there are very tough questions to answer. Let me give you some closing thoughts. All right? The first one is read your whole Bible. The book of Esther has awesome lessons in it. And chances are, had I not do this sermon, you would have never read this book. All right? Don't be like Nobi, who only likes the first half of Isaiah. All right? Read your whole Bible. All right? The Bible is there to form us as people of God. Now, here's a very interesting thing. As I mentioned when I opened this series, the book of Esther belongs to what's called the writings, all right? And the Jews arrange their books in a different way than we do. So Esther is there with like Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Psalms. In the order in which they are arranged, all right, another book that belongs to the writings is the book of Daniel, all right? And Esther and Daniel are right next to each other. And what's interesting about that is that Daniel, all right, is also a story about a king's court and about some Jews that are in it. And yet, the stories are very opposed to each other. Like in Daniel, the Jews in that story are completely unapologetic. Like, we're Jews, we're not going to compromise in any way. And God saves them. And in Esther, you have all these ethical questions, and you go like, And so you read the two stories back to back, and you go like, which is it? Like, am I supposed to be here and like plant a flag and like not compromise, or am I supposed to be like Esther and like wiggle? Right? But again, the Bible is trying to form people that read both of those stories. And the one thing that they are unified is that in both stories, God works. Again, we go around trying to make all the right moral choices. And sometimes that's black and white, but a lot of times that's gray. Right? And again, that paralyzes us. And we have all these opportunities to do awesome things that we don't do. Again, read your whole Bible. It challenges us in many ways. And sometimes even ways that challenge even like what we think good Christianity is. Sit with Esther. Let it challenge you. Ask the questions. Come up with some answers, right? But know that God is working. Another thing, again, super important, decide to act. Indecision is a decision. It's you deciding to do nothing. All right? But decide to do something. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have all of them. This story clearly shows us that. You don't have to have all of the answers. But God is with you. Take a course. You can correct. Until the day you die, you can course correct. But make choices. Choose to do something. Again, all right? Navigate the world with the full confidence that God is working in spite of our own questionables. All right? Are you always going to behave well at work? No. Are you always going to behave well at home? No. Are you always going to behave well at school? No. Will there be things that people will be able to point at you and be like, I don't know about that? Absolutely. All right? But that doesn't mean that God stops working. This story is clearly telling the people of Israel, I am not done with you. Even if you choose to stay in exile, I'm not done with you. Even if you choose to participate in some of the things that the world participates in, I'm not done with you. God is always, always, always working. And that ought to give us the freedom and the confidence to navigate a very complicated world. I hope that studying this book together, all right, has really inspired you in some new and challenging ways. Esther is an amazing book. And I think it's one, again, that really ought to inspire us to act. Man, if the past couple of weeks have not told you how difficult this world is, I don't know what does. Like fires and explosions and like so many things. Right? And as I'm sitting there praying for our world, as I'm sitting there praying for my family, as I'm sitting there praying for the church, you know what I mean? Like, even as a church, we're about to enter a difficult time. Like the fact that Paris and Zainabu are leaving, it's going to leave some holes. Right? And it's going to leave a lot of questions. Right? But the one thing that we cannot do is not do anything. This world has many problems, and a lot of times we don't believe that we're any kind of answer to any of them, but we couldn't be more wrong. We couldn't be more wrong. We are God's people. You're not here to just be a moral person. That is not your only contribution to this world. You're here to do some good. And again, reading the book of Esther ought to encourage us and give us the freedom to do awesome things for God. He is with us. He's with us. He's here. He's with you when you go to work. He's with you when you're at school. He's with you at your house. That ought to fill us with the faith that we need to do amazing things. Thank you.
All right. You know what? I got to give it to you. You delivered. You delivered. You delivered, Rodrigo. You delivered, you know? You hyped it up. Next week it's going to be great. You know, he always used the hands. It's going to be great. This was amazing. This was really amazing. And I just thank you so much for taking the time to teach us these amazing lessons from Esther. I feel like just, you know, from one nerd to another, I just want to say thank you for pointing out those little details. I love, when I'm reading my Bible, I love finding those details in stories that I didn't see before, like the king had a dream. And it changed, the king had a dream. And it changed everything, right? And I'm like, wow, I've never noticed that before. I've never noticed that before. But to see that that's how God is acting in that book, and that's how God acts in our lives as well. A lot of times we're praying for things and stuff just happens, like over here, that we toiling away at whatever we got going on, and in some